Welcome, everyone. My name is Benadiah. I'm a mystery. My job is to watch the events of this strange new multiverse being created due to the forever growing cause and effect that breathes life into these universes. These universes ask intriguing questions that inspire their very own existence. I must watch universes housed in worlds, some familiar, some unknown, and I must make sure to keep notes on events that transpire. Come join me. Here we have Jimmy Olsen. We know him as a friend of Clark Kent's and a supporter of Superman. Plus, he holds the secret that his friend and the hero he supports are one and the same. But that is the Jimmy Olsen we know. Here, we have a Jimmy Olsen who was never told the secret of Superman's identity. He dedicated his time trying to prove his suspicions, a task that would lead him down a road filled with hatred and rage. Here, we get to witness and ask the question, what if Jimmy Olsen became a member of the Red Lantern Corps?
Jimmy stood there stunned. He had snuck into the General Lane's office and decided to raid the place, to find any information he could about the identity of Superman. Clark and Lois had forgotten about the mission to unmask, so to speak, the Man of Steel. Jimmy had always wanted to know who he was, to shape the man behind the alien superhero who protected the world for all these years. Jimmy made sure the coast was clear and then started raiding for all the drawers and shelves of the office. He knew General Lane was the guy in the military that Superman had connections with. They worked together, communicated. He had a photo evidence of Lane using a signal device that only called or signaled Superman. Jimmy pulled open a drawer and shifted through it, then something caught his eye. A photograph, framed, of Lois and Superman with General Lane. And Lois was wearing her wedding dress, and they were at Superman's fortress. A place only for Superman. His location was still unknown. Jimmy stared at the picture, and suddenly it was like a veil was pulled away from Jimmy's perception of life. Superman's face suddenly became really familiar. Jimmy focused on Superman's face, and then refocused. Clark? Is that you? He muttered. Then he heard movement outside the office and he scrambled around quickly, grabbing his camera, snapping a few pictures, and then he hurried out of the office. Jimmy sat there in his apartment for hours way into the night, going through police reports, pictures, newspaper articles, and he looked into the day the meteor hit Smallville and that it aligned with the adoption reports for Clark, the strange situations that occurred as Clark grew up. He managed to get a hold of Clark's apartment lease, and it was around the same time Superman was first captured on camera saving people in Metropolis. He noted everything down, even the fact he never saw Clark being ill, he never took a sick day, he also never went to the kryptonite exhibit, which is Superman's weakness. Jimmy spent almost 24 hours researching, making phone calls, and piecing all the puzzle pieces together. He sat there on his couch. His wall, floor, and table were littered with paperwork. Clark Kent. You are Superman, Jimmy blurted. He was angry, annoyed. He remembered the day the suspicion was ignited that Clark may have been Superman, and Clark directly said no when Jimmy approached him about it. Jimmy slammed his fist on the table in front of him and then swiped his arm across the table, scattering the paperwork everywhere. Screw you! He yelled.
Driven by anger, Jimmy headed to another loyal friend, the wife of Clark Kent, the person he believed to be the wife of Superman, the talented and wonderful Lois Lane.
Lois sat there in her office, typing out her next article, when suddenly Jimmy burst in. Jimmy, oh my god, what are you doing? Lois asked. I need to talk to you right now, he replied. He made sure no one was around before closing the door. Sure, what's up? Lois said. I know about Clark, Jimmy hissed. What about Clark? Lois asked with a slight chuckle. That he's Superman, Jimmy said in a hushed tone. Lois let out a scoff. Jimmy, that's an old one. You know he's not. You've seen them together. Lois blurted. No, that was Martian Manhunter, or Miss Martian, whoever else on the Justice League can shapeshift, Jimmy stated. Lois stared at Jimmy with a slight glare. Jimmy, my husband is not Superman, she said sternly. Then her phone started ringing. She picked it up and ignored it. But the evidence, it's right there, Jimmy argued. Lois's phone rang once again, and once again she hung it up. Jimmy, he's not Superman, let it go, Lois growled. But I have the evidence, Jimmy barked. Yeah, what evidence? Lois snapped. She stood up, walked around her desk, and she stood right in front of Jimmy, her arms crossed. Clark's adoption lines up with the meteor shower that brought Superman here. Clark is never sick. He's never around when Superman is. And you and Clark got engaged the same time as you did your documentary on Superman. He took you to his fortress, Jimmy rambled on. Once again, Lois's phone started to ring. She picked up her phone, hung up, and slammed her phone down on the desk. She walked right up to Jimmy and stared into his eyes. Jimmy, pack it in, Lois snapped. Suddenly, the door swung open. Oi, Lois, check the news now, Perry White barked. Lois grabbed her remote and turned on the TV. The video footage of Doomsday battering the pure life out of Superman. His suit was torn, his body bruised, and his body all cut up. His skin was torn, and his body was drenched in blood. Oh my god, Lois gasped. Tears started streaming down her face. She clutched her stomach, her mouth was wide open, like the oxygen was being pulled out of her lungs. I don't see his eyes open. He's not moving. Is he even breathing? I think this monster thing just... I think Superman just died, the newswoman stuttered.
The death of Superman, a tragedy that I have witnessed many times in many universes. But not like this. Jimmy Olsen, a man who needed to communicate this delicate matter to his friend. He needed to know why Clark lied about his powers. What made things worse, not long after his death, Superman was outed to the world as Clark Kent, confirming Jimmy's theory to be true. Jimmy felt sad for Lois, and he missed his friend. But more than anything, he was angry. Why didn't Superman trust him with his secret? Jimmy trusted Clark with everything, and to Jimmy, a lack of trust was painful. He felt betrayed. His inner rage began to boil.
Jimmy waited for everyone to leave. He stood in front of the gravestone, which was embedded into the statue of Superman. Jimmy was sad, heartbroken and depressed. He had just lost his best friend. He was there when Superman first spoke on national TV, when Clark and Lois got married. He was Clark's best man. He remembered when Clark got promoted. He had bought Clark a baseball, which was from Smallville High. It was in an old charity shop, and it was dated the year Clark graduated. Clark kept in a glass showcase on his desk in his office. He also remembered every single time Superman had saved him. But the looming deceit, all of the deceit. Clark never told him his secret. Jimmy knew he would not have told a soul. He would have helped in any way he could. He would have died for Superman. Jimmy stood there as his anger boiled, erupted, and he looked at the words across the stone. Here lies Clark Kent, a husband, a journalist, and the savior of Earth. Here lies Superman. Long live the Man of Steel. Jimmy read it, then read it again, and read it again, and each time he read it, it made him even more angry. You should have told me. Pisses me off that you didn't tell me, man. You lied straight to my face. But most of all, I'm pissed that I never got to confront you about it. I wanted to look you in the eye and ask, why didn't you tell me? And now I'm never gonna know, Jimmy said out loud. Then he punched the gravestone again and again. Then he screamed out in pain as he clenched his hand. Then suddenly something lit up in the sky. He looked up and saw a red light flying straight at him. It crashed into the ground, smashing a gravestone nearby as it hit. Jimmy looked in shock, and his natural journalist instincts kicked in as he walked up to the crash site. He walked up to a small pit that the crash had made, and something floated out of it. It was a ring, emitting a bright red light. Jimmy heard it whispering in his head. He knew he should have turned around and called for help, or simply just ran away, but the red light was enchanting. He held his hand out and the ring flew at him, sliding ever so easy onto his middle finger. There was a surge of energy that flooded through him. As the red suit wrapped around him, Jimmy recognized the logo that formed on his chest, the ring on his finger, and the rage that fueled him. The Justice League fought the Red Lanterns for a few years. Jimmy managed to take pictures, which was used in the article that Lois wrote about certain events. Jimmy ran his hand over his chest, over the Red Lantern logo, and he looked at the ring. Rage. It's all I've felt since I found out the truth. And everyone involved is responsible. I'm gonna make him all pay. Jimmy hissed. Then he took flight. He flew off, allowing his rage to guide him.
Now, with the Red Lantern ring on his finger, Jimmy Olsen had the weapon to aid his revenge. Revenge on those who didn't trust him.
Jimmy landed on Lois's front garden. She had moved to her family home in Smallville a few days after Clark died. Lois stepped out of the house. Jimmy, oh my god, where did you get a Red Lantern ring? She gasped. He should have told me, you know. Jimmy barked. Wait, hang on, is this about Clark? Lois asked, taking several steps towards Jimmy. Of course it is. He was my best friend, Jimmy roared. Jimmy, please, you're scaring me. Stop this. Come inside. Take that bastard ring off. We can talk about this, Lois said with compassion in her voice. The time to talk is over, Lois, Jimmy grunted. He dived at Lois, tackling her to the ground. She tried to fight him off, but with his newfound strength, he overpowered her. He opened his mouth and spewed blood plasma all over her. The blood plasma started burning Lois, melting through her skin, muscles, and bones. She screamed an almighty scream that reached out throughout Smallville, echoing throughout the streets. Jimmy stood and watched as his friend and boss wriggled on the grass, and her face and chest became unrecognizable. The wriggling figure finally stopped, and Lois let out a harsh, strainful, and rough-sounding draw of breath, and Jimmy couldn't help but smile as he knew that the breath was her last. He watched Lois Lane die before him. He then took off and headed for his next target. Ever thought about one of your favourite fandoms and came up with a what-if scenario? Then leave a comment down below, and we might take your suggestion. If we do turn your suggestion into a audio drama on the Titles What If channel, we'll personally call you out at the end, letting everyone know that you came up with the idea. So, hit the comment section and let us know your what-if ideas. Jimmy flew into Perry White's office, breaking the window. He landed on the floor, and he stood there and stared at the very scared Perry White. Jim, what on earth are you doing? Perry muttered. Jimmy could feel his cold, fearful sweat drip down off his bald head. You knew about Clark, didn't you? Jimmy growled. No, Jimmy, I promise. I found out after he died like the rest of the world. I promise I did. Perry mumbled. Liar! Jimmy aimed his ring, and an energy blast fired from his ring and hit Perry on the head, his skull caving in from the attack. Perry's body went limp in his chair. Jimmy looked around the room. The amount of time, money, effort, blood, sweat, tears, and memories that had built the Daily Planet. Jimmy used to love the building, the work, the atmosphere, but now he hated it. The lies and betrayal that filled each office. Jimmy took a deep breath in, and then he flew straight up, breaking through the ceiling and the roof, and leaving the building. He floated several meters above the Daily Planet. He then raised his hand out. With blood and rage a crimson red, we fill men's souls with darkest dread, and twist your minds to pain and hate. We'll burn you all. That is your fate, Jimmy roared. Then a Red Lantern construct formed in the form of Superman. A gigantic Superman. Superman flew straight down and collided into the top of the Daily Planet, the construct ripping through the building. The building crumbled like it was made out of sand. The giant golden globe rolled across the street. Flames exploded. People screamed and cried out as the great Daily Planet crumbled before them or on top of them. Jimmy floated there with an evil grin, when suddenly he saw two green lights flying towards him at great speed. They both stopped with an incredible halt, a few feet away, and floated there. The two green lanterns faced Jimmy. "Hey there, Jimmy Olsen, right? You're Lois Lane's photographer?" one asked. "I was," Jimmy snapped. "I'm John Stewart, and this is my partner Hal. We're the Green Lanterns. We worked with Superman," the Green Lantern told him. "Friends, huh? I'll bet you knew who he really was," Jimmy snapped. "Is that what this is all about? Because Clark didn't tell you who he was? Jimmy, he was protecting you. Knowing his identity came with risks. Lois was always a target. It's a burden on all of us for our loved ones to know who we are." Hal barked to him. "I was his friend. I was always there. I could have helped him. Everything he told me was a lie," Jimmy roared. "Son, you have to calm down. You're playing with something you do not understand. The Red Lanterns fuel your rage, make you blindsided, cause you to act on impulses that result in dire consequences," John told him, pointing down at the destruction down below. "I know, and I'm starting to love it," Jimmy grinned. "Look at what you've done," Hal roared. "Do not bark at me, Hal. I was the photographer after Coast City. You cannot judge me," Jimmy said, pointing at him. Hal frowned at Jimmy and aimed his ring. The Green Lantern construct formed a pincer claw, and it flew at Jimmy, ready to grab him. Jimmy swifted to one side, dodging the attack. He aimed his own ring and sent an energy blast at the two Green Lanterns. Both of them raised their hands up to their chests, and both were increased in a green bubble that acted as a shield. The red energy blast hit the bubble with no effect. John then made two turret constructs floating next to the bubble, and both turrets opened fire, and Jimmy was hit with a barrage of lantern-made bullets. Jimmy grunted under the pain as he covered his face. Hal made an overly large hammer construct and whacked Jimmy with it. Jimmy came crashing down, hitting the road next to the destruction of the Daily Planet. Both Green Lanterns floated down to the ground, their constructs dematerializing. "I'll help the first responders with all this mess. You handle the nutcase, right?" Hal asked. "Good, and be nice. He's in mourning," John replied. Hal then flew off and started helping with the firefighters that had turned up, using his constructs to secure the civilians that had been injured in the attack. John walked over to Jimmy as he climbed to his feet. "Leave me alone!" Jimmy roared. Jimmy threw out a fist, and a blast of energy fired from his ring. John created a circle of solid energy deflecting the attack. John then made several chains that were anchored to the ground, and the chains wrapped around Jimmy, but Jimmy managed to pull them apart with brute strength. Then John jumped onto the offensive. He created two massive gauntlets that wrapped his fists, and then he jumped forward and threw out his fists in attack, hitting Jimmy in the torso, throwing him back to the floor. Jimmy stood slowly, he aimed his ring, and a blood portal opened in front of him. Jimmy looked at John, then back at the portal, and then he dived into the portal. John followed him through it, and the portal closed. Both Jimmy and John both stood in a field. "Where are we, man?" John asked. "I have no idea," Jim muttered. John took his stance, his Green Lantern gauntlet shimmering. Jimmy stood there unsure on what his next move should be. Suddenly, another blood portal opened and a monstrous alien stepped out. "Ah, yes, a new lantern filled with rage," the alien barked. "Atrocitus, really? Now?" John snapped. "You're the leader of the Red Lanterns?" Jimmy questioned. "I am, and I, Jimmy Olsen, am here to offer you power, pure rage, and revenge thicker than blood," Atrocitus growled at him. Jimmy took a step back. "Jimmy, do not listen to him. You made a mistake, man, sure. I can help you come back from it," John snapped. Jimmy shook his head. No. Shut up, the pair of you," Jimmy barked. "Come with me, Jimmy. Join us," Atrocitus roared. "No!" Jimmy roared back. He took a step back. He shook his head. His mind was foggy. He was uncertain, angry and upset. He felt guilty. Or did he? He was unsure of that too. He stood there with John the Green Lantern on one side, trying to help him redeem himself, and on the other side was Atrocitus, the leader of the Red Lanterns, offering him more power and aid in his mission of revenge to all those who had lied to him.
And with that, Jimmy Olsen was left with a conundrum. Would he repent for his sins and allow the Green Lantern John Stewart to aid him on the right path, a path towards redemption? Or would he side with the leader of the Red Lanterns and fall deeper into his pit of rage, weaponize it, allow it to consume him, and possibly become one of the most dangerous Red Lanterns Earth would ever see? Sadly, we are out of time. I must continue my quest on exploring the universe. Make sure you join me next time as we explore the wonders of the multiverse and we ask the age-old question, what if?